A 600cc Super Sport makes a lot more power than a 1900cc Hog, but a 650 Twin only makes half as much power as an inline 4 with slightly more torque. And then we have a 108 cubic inch liquid cooled Power Plus motor that makes more horsepower and torque than a 116 cubic inch Thunderstroke. None of this makes any sense. How is a new rider supposed to know what motorcycle to buy, and that an R7 is fair and easy to ride for a new rider, but a 600 would get you killed if you're a little too frisky on the throttle? It's a smaller number, it should be a slower bike. But that's not how it works. All I'm saying is, from the outside, people don't understand how engine displacement, cylinder count, and horsepower are all related or interconnected. Until now. We're going to dive in and talk a little bit about how displacement, cylinder count, and my favorite, revolutions, relate to actual power and how these things actually make sense once you know what you're looking for. By the end of this, you'll be able to figure out why big 117 cubic inch Harleys are slow and why smaller engines like a 600 are fast, and how they kind of relate to each other or not. So let's break down the basics of what matters. And for you internet trolls out there, this is general. It's not very specific to any particular type of motorcycle, and there's always going to be an exception to the rule in general, but this is a safe way to understand what's happening and how it relates to each other. First and foremost, we're going to start off with something that's very, very basic, and that is, how many cylinders does an engine have? That's the first thing we're going to cover. And then the second part is going to be the size. With these two things, we can get a very good idea of horsepower and torque and build a general relationship between the two. And it's a pretty easy way to figure out how two motorcycles relate to one another. So let's talk cylinder count. On the most basic level, we have our simple one-cylinder engine. Think a KLR 650 or a Duke 390. These are generally high torque, low horsepower engines. They don't rev very high. They're usually easy to handle, and they're considered torquey. You twist the throttle, you get a lot of feedback, a lot of acceleration from changing the throttle input at lower RPMs. People love these things for off-road, new riding. They're easy to cruise in traffic, but they don't make the most amount of power. But what happens when you go to 2 cylinders and 3 cylinders, 4, 5, and even 6? As you jump from 1 cylinder to 2 cylinder, you begin to increase horsepower. The engine becomes more balanced, you can rev higher, and you start to increase horsepower and revs, which revolutions we will talk about later. It is very important in how an engine makes horsepower later on down the line, and we'll talk about that as well. For now, same displacement, more cylinders equals more power. Horsepower specifically, we're not talking about torque. So for this example, we're going to take 4 engines with 4 different cylinder counts all around the 650cc displacement. So for our 1 cylinder, we have the KLR 650, has horsepower, torque. We have a Ninja 650, horsepower and torque. A Daytona 660, horsepower and torque. And then finally, we have a Ninja, a 636, horsepower and torque. As you can see, all of these have about 50-ish pound-feet of torque, but they have vastly different horsepower numbers. The 1-cylinder KLR 650 has about 40 horsepower. When you jump up to the twin in the Ninja 650, you get close to that 70 horsepower mark. You jump up to the triple 660, you have just under 100 horsepower, and then the inline 4 has close to 120. These are all round numbers. Obviously, like I said at the beginning, this is not specific, nitpicking exact numbers. It's a general idea for you guys to understand how these things relate. The main reason for the horsepower difference is revolutions, which we're going to talk a little bit later. But just so you understand, a similar displacement engine with a similar cylinder count will have about the same horsepower and torque. If it's a similar displacement engine with more cylinders, it's going to make more horsepower at about the same amount of torque. So in a hypothetical world here, if you have an 1800cc twin, kind of like the older Harleys, and an 1800cc boxer like the Goldwing engine, the Goldwing engine is going to make about the same amount of torque as the Harley, but it's going to make more horsepower, more cylinders. 2 cylinders and 6 cylinders, same torque at the same displacement, with this one having less power, this one having a lot more power due to the cylinder count. So if cylinder count determines horsepower, how do we have baggers with huge amounts of actual torque? And here's where the old adage comes in. There's no replacement for displacement. The bigger the engine, the more torque it can make. So if you take a 650cc single cylinder engine that makes about 50 horsepower, and then you double the size of the engine, you're not gonna exactly double the amount of torque, but you can see that torque increases relative to the size of the engine. The perfect example of this is the old long-standing Evo Sportster. The Evo Sportster has 2 engines, an 883 and a 1200cc version. So 883 cc's, 1200 cc's. But they're basically the same engine in almost every single way. The technology, the cylinders, the heads are basically the same. The only difference between them is really the displacement. So when you look at the 883, it makes 54 pound-feet of torque, while the 1200 makes 74 pound-feet of torque. These are both twins. These are both basically the same engine geometry. The bigger engine just makes more torque. So kind of tying this back into the whole cylinder thing, right? So if you take an 883 or a 1200, 1200 is a little bit easier. It makes about 74 foot-pounds of torque in this engine configuration. If you were to make a hypothetical Harley engine that was a triple cylinder at about 1200 cc's, it would make roughly the same amount of torque, but it would make more horsepower. Harley just chooses to continually and indefinitely increase displacement. That's why all of their engines just get bigger and bigger. The only 2 ways to add power is more cylinders or bigger engine. And obviously it's clear which one Harley has chosen. There's a little caveat to that, which obviously you can make more efficient, better engines, which they also have chosen not to do until somewhat recently. But that is completely different, and that's where kind of things change in terms of modern technology and older technology. And that is kind of how we get to the Sportster S versus the old Sportster 1200. The Sportster S is a 1250cc, but it makes more torque and way more horsepower. It makes almost 100 foot-pounds of torque. I think it's 95 foot-pounds of torque and 120 horsepower compared to the old Evo engine that was 74 horsepower or 74 foot-pounds of torque, 74 pound-feet of torque, and 50-something-ish horsepower. I don't remember the exact number. It'll be over here. That is modern engine design, increasing the potential, but the rules stay the same. If you're looking at the 1250cc Rev Max in the Sportster S, and then you're looking at the 999cc Rev Max in the Nightster, same engine design, very different in terms of what the Evo offered. It's a more modern engine, but when you look at those compared to each other, the Sportster S makes more horsepower and more torque when compared to the Nightster. Same engine design, same technology, it ups the amount of torque the engine can make, but the rule still applies. Bigger engine, same technology, more power. So the Sportster S 1250 makes 95 foot-pounds of torque, and then the 999 makes close to 70. So bigger engine, more torque. On the other hand, leaving the twin world, we have a very similar example, but in the case of a 4-cylinder. And 4-cylinder super sports are basically the best and easiest example for this. You have 600s, 750s, 1000, and we'll go 1300, right? So we're talking Gixxers, 600, 750, 1000, and the Hayabusa. All of these are 4-cylinder engines They have roughly the same technology. Obviously, I understand the sizing difference inside of the engine, but they have the same amount of cylinders. So the only real difference between these is the displacement. The technology between similar year 600 all the way to the Busa is roughly the same, so the engine technology isn't drastically different. But as you increase displacement, you increase torque. And we're going to be looking at displacement and torque specifically on each of these bikes. So the Gixxer 600 makes close to that 50 horsepower mark that the single cylinder 650 did. This one's 45 foot-pounds of torque. So 600, smallest engine, least amount of torque, 45. Then you jump up to the 750. With the 750, you get 63 foot-pounds of torque. So you have that bump in torque. Yes, there's horsepower. We're going to explain why in just a little bit, but for right now, just torque. The 1000 makes almost 90 foot-pounds of torque. It's 83 and a half, or sorry, 86 and a half or something like that. And then obviously you have the Busa, which makes the most amount of torque. I mean, it's like, so as you can see, there's really no replacement for displacement. That statement is true. Bigger displacement equals more torque. But there is a replacement for displacement, and it's my favorite thing. It's called revolutions, RPMs, the good old rip'ems. And that's because horsepower kind of doesn't exist. As we know it today, dynos actually only read torque and then do math equations to try to figure out what the horsepower number is. So a true dyno only reads torque, and horsepower is just a mathematical calculation. You can take torque, a specific number of torque, multiply it by specific RPMs, and then you get your actual horsepower. So based on the math, if you take 50 foot-pounds of torque at, let's say, 3,000 RPMs, you get this much horsepower. But if you take 50 foot-pounds of torque at 6,000 RPMs, you get this much horsepower. But if you take 50 pound-feet of torque and you multiply it by 10,000 RPM, you get this much horsepower. So as you can see, the simple basic equation is more revs equals more horsepower, because it's that amount of torque. Now I understand that torque works in a curve and it's not specific, yada yada, but if you can get a high torque engine to rev higher, it will make more horsepower. The problem is torque runs in a curve just like anything else, and it's based on displacement, it's based on the engine design, it's based on the technology inside of that engine. How much air can you get in? That's why old Harleys don't make a lot of power and the new ones make a lot more power, because there's more air, more torque, there's engine technology there. If you guys want to see a video about how the relationship between that works, let me know, but that's a lot more detail that we don't need to get into right now. For now, more cylinders, more horsepower, more revs, more horsepower, more size equals more torque, which means more horsepower. Going back to that first example, all of the 650-ish cc motorcycles had vastly different horsepower numbers, but they had the same amount of torque. But if you look really closely, I'll put this back here, they all had different RPM numbers too. When you add more cylinders, the engine becomes more balanced. It's easier to spin faster. So therefore, it revs higher and makes more horsepower. The single cylinder KLR, if you've ever ridden anything with a single cylinder, they vibrate a lot. The engines are not balanced, they're very buzzy, and you can just feel everything rattling and shaking as you're riding it. When you go to two cylinders, it becomes more smooth, less vibration, more balanced. It allows the engine to actually rev up faster without literally shaking itself apart. That's true when you add a third cylinder, a fourth cylinder, a sixth cylinder. That's why Gold Wings, you can put the coin on the engine and you don't feel it. It becomes more balanced, so it can rev faster. So technology does play a role in this a little bit. If you take a 1200cc engine and pack enough technology to figure out a way to make it rev higher, you will get more horsepower and more torque, kind of comparing the 1200 Evo to the 1250 Rev Max. It's a more modern design engine. This engine with the Evo revved to about 6,000 RPM. The new Rev Max literally revs to 9,500 horsepower. So it has more potential for torque and it has more potential for horsepower. So technology plays a role into all of this. That's a topic for another day. If you guys want me to go into that, that can be its own separate video. But for right now, more cylinders at the same displacement is more power. That's why the R7 makes less power and is a more beginner-friendly bike than the smaller R6. The R6, more cylinders, more horsepower. Roughly the same amount of torque, with the R7 having more because it has bigger displacement. So 2-cylinder R7, 4-cylinder R6. The 2-cylinder bigger displacement engine will make more torque. The 4-cylinder smaller engine, slightly smaller, will make a lot more horsepower because it has more cylinders, more revs equals more power. 2, bigger means better. There is no replacement for displacement. If you have one engine that is 600 cc's and you make basically the same engine at 750 cc's, just like our Gixxers, the 750 is going to make more horsepower and torque. And if you take that to the 1000 cc's, you're going to get more horsepower and torque. The same thing with the Busa. If it's basically the same engine and you add size, you get more torque and therefore more horsepower because math. And then we have the third thing, which is revolutions. If you can take an engine and find a way for it to intake more air and rev higher, you have a bigger potential, notice, potential for horsepower. That's why the old low revving Sportster 1200 doesn't make a lot of horsepower and torque compared to the new 1250, which is basically the same sized engine, but the newer bike just has a lot more technology that allows it to rev higher and get a little bit more air, and that's how it's allowed to do so. So revolutions are a replacement for displacement, given the engine technology is able to do that. And that's how we've gotten to modern engines, is just how do we get more air under more pressure faster. Ta-da! Thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little nerdy sit down discussing engines and engine displacements. Crazy enough, obviously I know that this is specifically about motorcycles and motorcycle displacements, but it's actually how cars work too, to a certain extent. That's why your 5.3 Chevy compared to your 5.0 Ford, the Chevy makes a little bit more torque. The engine design on the Coyote engine is actually made to rev higher, so it makes a little bit more horsepower, and there's just a balance to all of this stuff. And it's true for just all engines. This isn't specifically for motorcycles. This just happens to be a motorcycle channel, and it's something that a lot of people don't understand. If you want to see more stuff like this, comment below, let me know. Like I said, I appreciate you guys watching this little nerd session. Peace.